Cool, I'll be back in 2. So I waited and waited and you guessed the rest. He never came back, nor did my vest, nor did my car keys, my car, or my purse. You know what I got and that's the end of the verse. Ah, it's gotta be. You know that. It can only be. What's it called? Don't let it catch you. It's always. It can only be. Yeah, I hope you've been paying attention, cause I'm gonna tell you one last time. Come on now. Come on, girls. It's always. It can only be. Come on, girls, one last time. Hey, let me have it. Oh, yeah. It can only be. It's spin, baby. Now, take it from me. You don't know who to trust. You gotta watch yourself, cause you know it's coming. It's spin, baby.
Look, man, I was searching for a better way, praying, hoping for a better day. Never quit, never hesitate. If it's a will, it's gotta be a way. Working fast food on the weekends, got a second job just to meet ends. Never quit though, I admit at times life seemed to be in pieces. I had to switch up the plan, good at the can, created the brand, investing in self.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dominique Ryder, and I'm one of the producers for CLASSIX, as well as a director for the excerpt of Big White Fog that you'll be seeing later tonight. CLASSIX was created by theater director Awoye Tempo to expand the classical canon through an exploration of dramatic works by Black writers. We define these classic works as plays by authors of African descent from around the world that speak profoundly to the times in which they were written and resonate deeply from within our own. CLASSIX engages artists, historians, students, professors, and audiences to launch these plays into the public imagination and spark productions worldwide. With regards to our panel tonight, I offer you this quote from social theorist Orlando Patterson. He begins, "Alienated from all rights or claims of birth, he ceased to belong to his own right to any legitimate social order. Culturally isolated from the social heritage of his ancestors, he had a past, but a past is not a heritage." And this is where we begin tonight, by attempting to reach back into the past and to claim it for our own and to make it a heritage. The sort of theme of tonight is, how does a past become a heritage? We at CLASSIX are thrilled to be partnering with Princeton's Lewis Center for the Arts for this event. Thank you all so much for joining us. What you'll be experiencing tonight is a culmination of our interest of finding new ways to think and engage with theater. You'll be hearing from a combination of artists and scholars tonight as they really dig into the ideas present in these plays from the various Negro units during the time of the Federal Theater Project. Our moderator tonight is NYU Associate Professor Michael Dinwiddie. Professor Dinwiddie is a writer, performer, and a scholar with a focus on African-American theater history, dramatic writing, filmmaking, and ragtime music. His dramatic work has been produced at theaters and schools around the country, and he worked as a staff writer on the ABC TV's Hangin' with Mr. Cooper. He was awarded a 1995 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in Playwriting and served for several years as the president of the Black Theater Network. He has taught a wide array of courses, including Poets in Protest, Footsteps to Hip Hop, Cissy Blake in the Minstrel Tradition, and Cultural Memory and Resistance. Please join me in welcoming Michael Dinwiddie. Take it away, Michael.
Thank you so much, Dominique. And welcome to you, audience. Tonight's conversation will give us an opportunity to explore the legacy of the Negro Units of the Federal Theater Project. And I'm honored to introduce our distinguished panel. First is Dr. Autumn Womack. She's an assistant professor at Princeton in the African American Studies and English departments. Her research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of late 19th century and early 20th century African American literary culture, visual studies, and print culture. She teaches courses in those areas as well as on the history of race and media. Dr. Womack serves on the editorial board of the Langston Hughes Review and Asterix Journal. Her work can be read in such publications as Black Camera, an International Film Journal, and the Paris Review. Her first book, The Matter of Black Living, The Aesthetic Experiment of Racial Data, 1880 to 1930, is coming out this fall. Welcome, Autumn.
Thank you.
And we're also joined by Dr. Kinohi Nishikawa, an associate professor at Princeton of English and African American Studies. His work specializes in 20th century African American literature, book history, and popular culture. He's currently working on a new project called Black Paratext, which is a study of how book design has influenced the production and reception of African American literature from World War II to the present. His courses at Princeton focus on African American humor, African American literary history, and Afro-Asian studies. Welcome, Kinohi.
Thank you, Michael.
And last but not least is Arminda Thomas, dramaturg, archivist, musician, and a member of CLASSIX. As a dramaturg, she has worked at theaters across the country, including Here Arts Center, it's in New York, Baltimore Center Stage, New Federal Theater, and Marin Theater Company. She's worked as Associate Artistic Director and Resident Dramaturg for Going to the River Festival. And she's also worked for many years as a Literary Associate and Archivist for Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee's D. Davis Enterprises, where she served as Executive Producer for the Grammy Awarded audiobook with Ossie and Ruby, In This Life Together, and as a consultant for the film Life's Essentials with Ruby D. So welcome, Arminda. You can unmute. I want to welcome you, really welcome you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Michael.
Yes. So I want to thank all of you for being here and being a part of this conversation tonight. So to get us started, let's take a moment and get a 5-minute summary of the Federal Theater Project and the Negro Units. And we're going to blank ourselves out while that shows.
As President Roosevelt came into office in 1933 at the height of the Great Depression, he began to institute sweeping changes in an attempt to stabilize the economy and create new jobs.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
This New Deal Roosevelt had promised during his campaign was a series of domestic programs. One of the most well-known was the Works Progress Administration, which created jobs in sectors from construction to art. Commonly known as the WPA, the Works Progress Administration ultimately employed over 8.5 million people. Throughout the New Deal, Black activists fought for reforms to enhance the benefits of the New Deal to Black people. There were 5 arts-related projects created as part of the WPA, and one of them was the Federal Theater Project, a national program to create work for theater professionals. Headed by Hallie Flanagan, the Federal Theater Project launched in 1935 and aimed to engage the social issues of the time in communities around the country and create a non-commercial American theater. Central to its mission was the idea to democratize drama and make it available for all. One of the unsung heroes of this era was Rose McClendon. Rose McClendon was an acclaimed actress, producer, and co-founder of the Negro People's Theater in New York. She was part of an organizational meeting for the Federal Theater Project, during which she proposed the idea of creating separate Negro units around the country to specifically focus on Black stories and Black artists. The idea was enthusiastically received, and over the next year, the New York City Project organized the Federal Negro Theater at Harlem's Lafayette Theater, as well as the Negro Youth Theater, the African Dance Unit, and a vaudeville unit. Over 1,000 Black artists on stage and behind the scenes were employed by the New York Negro Unit alone. Negro units were created in regions around the country. The Eastern region had units in cities such as Hartford, Boston, Philadelphia, and Newark. In the West were Seattle, Portland, and Los Angeles. The Midwest had units in Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, and Peoria. And in the South, there were Negro units in Atlanta, New Orleans, Raleigh, and Birmingham. At the dawn of the Federal Theater Project, there were 17 Negro units, and by the end, there were additional units added in cities like Okmulgee, Oklahoma, Buffalo, Camden, and Durham, bringing the total to 22. This time brought a tremendous variety of plays. Often political, they included works such as Heaven Bound, a morality play adapted by Laura Ward, Frank Wilson's Walk Together Children, about the forced deportation of 100 African American children, and Honra Bontom and County Cullen's Conjure Man Dies, which was a farce in 3 acts based on the story by Harlem Renaissance writer Rudolph Fisher. The Newark Unit's production of a courtroom drama entitled The Trial of Dr. Beck was so successful it transferred to Broadway. Then there was Big White Fog, Natural Man, and the unproduced living newspaper Liberty Deferred. The units had resident playwrights and held workshops for writing and the technical trades of the theater. In most cases, Black producers and directors were also at the helm of the unit. But years of attempting to tell the Black political story and transform the American landscape through racial integration in the larger federal project found many artists, and also Flanagan herself, in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. After 4 years, the Federal Theater Project came to an end. But the rich archive of plays from the Negro units tell a wide array of stories and give tremendous insight into the thinking of the time. And that vibrant past is a part of our heritage today.
Welcome back. I'm going to take just a couple of seconds to reflect on what we just saw, which I thought was pretty remarkable in terms of historical perspective. The first thing is, most of us didn't know or don't know that much about the federal project, the whole thing, the work progress, all that. And in the first slide there, it says the work progress administration is what, well, that's actually what the narrator said, but it was changed to work program because the notion of progress sounded progressive, and we're in the 1930s and people are frightened by the notion there's too much going on, too much change. And so already we have this kind of interesting moment in our history where we're trying to change the narrative of what the arts can do and what we can do for people. And we're already resisting it from the very beginning. Is it too progressive? It's okay to call it a program, but to call it progressive or progress is an issue that was really, really fraught. The other thing that's interesting to me is the Federal Theater Project. My first job's in New York with the new Federal Theater under Woody King Jr. And he did the Macbeth, the so-called Voodoo Macbeth, which Orson Welles had organized and reconstructed. I was in that production. And he also did a production, The Trial of Dr. Beck. So Woody King has kept alive that heritage in some very, very interesting ways. And so that's fascinating to me, that those things. And then the other thing that's not mentioned in this, but I just want to en passant say that, you know, there was a Yiddish theater unit as well. There was a French theater unit as well. I think it's important to point out that this idea that Hallie Flanagan had of having different groups be represented and to have theater for all the people. So that's all I really wanted to say as we start. And as we get our conversation going, I'd love to hear from our panelists. And I'll start with you, Autumn. You know, what did you find compelling in this story? What brings you here?
Yeah, thank you. It's such an incredible little short film. And what really stands out to me is just the scope and range of the Black creative practice and ambition and skill, right? That we see, the range of it that we see across all of these different units and across the different kinds of productions that were being staged. So just the range in genre, right? That there was political theater, and then iterations of classical theater, and then dance-driven theater, and then takes on vaudeville, right? So just kind of the scope and range of Black creative and expressive practice that's on display there, and just the gathering of the profession, right? We don't often think of Black theater historically, right? We haven't often thought of it as a tutored, skilled profession. It's often something that we think Black folks just do, right? So kind of seeing it professionalized here and seeing that on display was really, really quite striking.
Okay, thank you. And how about you, Kinohi?
Yes, I think the video gets at, as Autumn said, a lot of the imaginative possibilities that the project brought to audiences in its time. I was reading that the Federal Theater Project as a whole employed upwards of 10,000 people at its height, and this during the Great Depression. So in addition to bringing together a bunch of theater workers to actually put on revelatory productions, it really met baseline material needs during a time of economic stress and employed thousands of workers and really allowed them to imagine and create at a time when people were struggling to get by. So whenever I teach the 1930s, I like to show documentary photography of that era. And they're classic and for a reason, because they're so stark in terms of their depiction of the material deprivation. Well, the project offered theater workers a space and the conditions to imagine temporarily a world outside of that.
You know, that's a really fascinating way to think about it too, the visual culture of the moment of the time. And this is where we get Jacob Lawrence creating his migration series. This is where we get the incredible black and white photographs that really depict what's going on in America. And you talk about the deprivation. In some ways, we're experiencing that again in this moment in our culture. So we wonder how can the theater help to heal that? What can we do in terms of that? And this notion at the time, it was so radical, the idea of a theater that's a federal theater, not a national theater, not like the Abbey, not like the Moscow Theater, but a theater that is going to go to different neighborhoods, different worlds, and bring forth the voices of those folks. And talking about bringing forth the voices, Arminda, give me your take on this as an archivist, as a dramaturg. You know, what's enticing to you about this period and the Negro Units?
So much, but I'm going to jump away from theater for a half second to say that the thing that I think initially drew me in about the Works Progress Program administration was the amount of material of culture that we got just because people needed work. So, you know, we have the reminiscences of formerly enslaved people because of the Works Progress Administration, because writers went out to interview these people, and we got, you know, their memories, however compromised some of them were. We got those memories, and we got field recordings, folk music. You know, Zora Neale Hurston was off doing a lot of that. So just the amount of culture that was preserved in the service of putting people to work is fascinating to me about the whole thing. And then when we get to the Negro Theater Units, one of the things that's just amazing to me is the cities. There's 22 cities. Oklahoma, what's happening here? Chicago, we're not all that surprised about, but there's so much that outside of Chicago for Black theater, there's not a whole lot that you hear about outside of New York and Chicago. So, you know, the work that was being done in Seattle, the work that was being done in Atlanta, the work that was being done in North Carolina, just allowing ourselves to branch out. And Hallie Flanagan's idea of, you know, of creating basically a national theater network, of using this moment to really embed theater in the communities, in the various communities and make it serve that way. For me, that is the thing that I find just so fascinating about this time.
The radical idea in its time, because people weren't going to the theater that much. It was considered something for the elite, for the upper class. People were listening to the radio, they were going to the movies, but the theater, that was something that was, and Hallie Flanagan coming out of experimental theater, having gone to Grinnell College, having studied in Russia and being one of the first women to get a Guggenheim, to go and study theater, and then to come back and say, let's create a theater for all people in our country. This is a narrative we need to hear more of, I think, even today. This idea that we want people to be able to celebrate their identities and also to share those identities with others. So next, we're going to watch some scenes from plays that were written by authors during this time and that were produced by the Federal Theater Project. Natural Man by Theodore Browne, Liberty Deferred by Abram Hill and John de Silvera, and Big White Fog by Theodore Ward. Now, I want Arminda to give us a little setup on this and what's useful for us to know before we get into these excerpts.
Sure. The plays that selected, the director selected the scenes, but the plays were selected. We wanted to get the flavor of coming from different cities. So Natural Man is a folk play. It's a folk play, and it came out of the Seattle unit, where Theodore Browne was the assistant director and the playwright. And it's based on John Henry. We'll talk about that more later. And then Theodore Ward's Big White Fog came out of Chicago in 1938. It was controversial then. It just managed to get itself produced, but it made quite an impression. And then Abram Hill and John Silvera and Liberty Deferred. This was a living newspaper theater. So I like that we have a folk play, a very political play, and then this living newspaper segment that did not get produced.
Right.
And we'll talk a little bit more about, I want to talk a little bit more about that later, but because but it was not produced, but it went through several drafts. So it did get, revised and revised before it did not get produced.
Okay. All right. So we're going to go away again and watch our screen. We really want to thank our actors. We want to thank them. We want to applaud for them and let them know that we love what you brought to us. You helped illustrate exactly what we're talking about and what we're thinking about tonight. We want to thank our directors as well. Thank Dominique and all those who worked with the actors to create this wonderful, wonderful work for us and to give us a glimpse and to show us how timely it really is. It's so interesting. In 1931, we had the Scottsboro Boys coming to trial in Alabama, young men ages 12 to 19, 13 to 19 years old being tried for rape and being sentenced to death. In 2021, only 90 years later, we have a whole other moment where we face American justice and notion of what can be just and how does our system work. So this is framing our plays, our discussion, and what we're looking at tonight. So let's just jump right in. So it's 90 years ago when these plays are written and hearing them. So Arminda, what comes to mind for you in terms of how you want to discuss and think about this in this present moment?
Oh my goodness, so much, right? That was a lot.
It was, it really was.
I want to start with Big White Fog because it was the last thing, and I was looking over in the comments, and there is a section. It goes further. There is I think one of the attendees said it seems like two sides of the same two sides of capitalism. How is this communism thing coming in? And that is it comes in the third act. Because Les, who is the student, becomes involved with Marxists and starts to see what's happening as a class struggle, and that which is very close to where Theodore Ward was, and that is an important moment in the play. But there's something that is so today. I feel like I have sat in a room with uncles having that argument. That is not an argument that goes away. And then just on a personal note, CLASSIX has been working on In Dahomey, and which also has is set in the frame of a Back to Africa movement that was happening at the time with Bishop Turner, who was trying to, Henry McNeil Turner, who was arguing for a return to Africa in the face of the failure of Reconstruction. So, just the way these things cycle and the way we come back to, what does it mean to belong anywhere, to belong here when you say, this is where my roots are. And then ain't no more. The year before last time it blurs, but at the public, which was also a kind of common tragic meditation on what it would mean to leave here. So it's just I just find it, that it holds this resonance that that's really interesting to me. And if anybody else has any thoughts on that.
I'm trying to be polite because I have thousands, but so Kinohi, did you want to say something? Kinohi, did you want to unmute and bring?
I wanted to talk a little bit about liberty deferred, which I think is resonant for different reasons. I have a kind of keen interest in works that really didn't connect with an audience in their time for a variety of reasons. Mm-hmm. And the fact that liberty deferred wasn't realized is for me indicative of the flip side of what I earlier called the promises of the New Deal. Liberty deferred's non-production really points up the pitfalls of the Federal Theater Project, whose mission under Flanagan really was one of stressing inclusion in the national polity. And what you have here in this incredible living newspapers work is a compilation of close to 40 scenes that document America's injustice to Black people. Mm-hmm. And there's a point in here that, there's a point in the work where the playwrights give you depictions of minstrels and essentially Black stereotypes throughout history. And in reading that, I was reminded of this incredible ending to Bamboozled, Spike Lee's film, where he just gives us and really shows America and American popular culture for what they are, which is a kind of history of denigrating Black people in the very media people used to consume as a matter of form. Liberty deferred is kind of constructed on this in-your-face aesthetic. It doesn't try to make things into a kind of coherent narrative. It certainly doesn't end with this notion that Black people finally belong. Another scene is set in Lynchotopia, where victims of lynching go into this purgatory and compare how many of their constitutional rights have been violated. And of course, in the scene that CLASSIX staged so brilliantly, we have two white figures, a couple who are touring this living newspaper and having their own presumptions thrown back at them. I have to imagine that the inclusion of this couple, who are our guide through this menagerie, this kind of maze, was one reason that the play couldn't be produced, right? I mean, it almost sort of shows interracial audiences that we are not all equal, that white audience members have, the guy's name is Jimmy North and Mary Lou South. So there's a real sense in which Liberty Deferred's non-production was a result of it being a funhouse mirror that held up, sort of exposed American racism in all the absurd, surreal, and crazy forms that it took. Thank
It's
you.
so amazing to me as people say things, there's resonance in different, because when you say Fun House, I think of Funny House of the Negro by Adrian Kennedy, which also does the same thing. You know, it's like we have this kind of ongoing critique, this ongoing notion of the insanity of where we are and how do we deal with that? So Autumn, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I was really struck watching it, thinking about how these historical actors, right, are kind of come to life in what today we would call kind of these speculative imaginaries, right? We spend a lot of time right now thinking about kind of all the gaps and elisions in the historical archive and the record, and how do we give voice, right, to those figures and those events and those kind of violent erasures. How do we account for them, right? What do they sound like? And we spend a lot of time thinking about what they might have said, who they might have encountered. So it was so striking to me that in Liberty Deferred, this is exactly what's getting staged, right? What might an encounter between Benjamin Banneker and Thomas Jefferson have sounded like, have looked like, right? What might it have looked like if Phyllis Wheatley received this letter from George Washington, and how might she have responded to that? What might she have said to that? And kind of really imagining the full kind of range of encounters that these folks who were all in each other's circles, right? Benjamin Banneker certainly knew about Thomas Jefferson and vice versa, right? What might that encounter have looked like? How can we imagine what they sounded like and looked like, and this kind of this really speculative archival practice that we see being staged here? I thought it was incredible and just so in line with the kind of work that folks are doing today. So that just, it stood out to me as just so timely.
Yeah, it connected with me too. I thought of the Octoroon and
Yeah.
these two pieces being Daniel Boucicault's piece in dialogue with Brandon Jacob, that's it, right, Arminda?
Brandon Jacob Jenkins.
Thank you very much. Okay, Brandon, I get it. Susan, Laurie Parks, Brandon Jacob. Okay, good. And so I just want to make sure I get it right. But I thought about that, and then the other thing that hit me was in sound, the way sound is used in the first one, the notion of the sound, the train whistle, and then the last one we hear a whistle that ends the scene. And I'm thinking about, and in the first one too, just to think about it for a second, it almost became a cipher as they were talking about the train and the whistle and the sound and things like that. And I'm saying, oh, I can see these parallels with the culture today. So Arminda, what do you want to add?
I wanted to tag on to the Liberty Deferred Lynchtopia scene. One of the other things that that gets brought up in and around that scene, that the anti-lynching bill is being held up in Congress by filibuster.
Yes.
Which
Here we are.
come on, y'all.
Why do we always have to bring you to the truth of the moment, of the truth of what we're going through and what we're experiencing? You know, one of the things, Arminda, you said earlier, you were like, and they were doing theater in Oklahoma, and and I was like, well, I'm from Oklahoma. I was born in Muskogee, Oklahoma. And when they said Okmulgee, I was shocked because I had no idea of the scope of the Federal Theater Project. I only knew of New York, growing up in there. I mean, I knew they did things in Chicago, Big White Fog, and in Seattle, Natural Man, things like that. But I didn't know that it really went all across the country in so many ways, and really was a notion of, we want to take theater to the people. We want the people to have a theater of their own. And so that locally, we're going to write plays, we're going to create things, and we're going to make sure that people get an opportunity to do that. So I just wonder, today we take theater, we have little theaters, we have community theaters and all those things. But in that period, in that time, first of all, America was in a deep depression. I mean, horrific. So, horrific. And I mean, I guess in some ways there's a parallel there as well in terms of those of us who are really still struggling to recover from what's going on. Why theater? What is it about theater that's so special? Why do we have to have the theater as opposed to the music or dance, or maybe we need them all, I don't know, but what is it about the experience of the theater?
Michael, I think you touched on this earlier when you mentioned the pressures that radio was putting on theater precisely during this era. You have a depression that cut the profession off from material resources, and you have a relatively cheap alternative form of entertainment that has mass communication possibilities. This project stepped in to sort of say, there's still a place for live performance and the communal enjoying thereof that matter to art making and to the consuming of art. Speaking for the promises of the project, I think it's important, even though all of us are watching this in a webinar, to remember that the intention of Natural Man and Big White Fog were to stage them in front of live audiences that were often interracial, but sometimes were prioritized for Black audiences. And that quality that Arminda was pointing out earlier, which, by the way, I also hear in A Raisin in the Sun, and innumerable Black plays that essentially stage deep conversations of what one attendee talked about, Black consciousness dialogue. You know, the freedom to sort of stage these dialogues in a family setting hinges on imagining this being taken in by a Black audience and not really worrying about what white people will overhear. And so that sense of a communal live performance, of being in the same space, and in some ways watching your own doubts, hopes, dreams, frustrations reflected back to you, is really what's at the heart of why theater became very important for the project in the late 30s.
And when you mention Raisin in the Sun, I think of Lorraine Hansberry, but I also think of her father, who was called the king of the kitchenettes. He did exactly what they talked about in this play, of buying buildings and cutting them up into small apartments, because it was so hard for African Americans to find apartments. So Black landlords, Jess Binga, others, Oscar DePriest, who became a congressman at the time and was also one of the people pushing the anti-lynching bill. All these men made their fortune basically in buying buildings and making apartments for Black people, places for Black people to live. So I'm just wondering, you know, Arminda, again, and Autumn and Kinohi, as we muse and think about this, which of these plays do we want to see back on the stage? Which ones do we think should be seen again today? Autumn, what do you think? Which one would you really want to see? I'm scared to hear the answer, but I'm excited to hear.
I mean, I really want to see Liberty Deferred. I think it's so wild in all the right ways, right? And it just, I can see it. Like I can see it at the public theater or something, right? Like it feels so experimental in a way that I would love to see it produced. And just because it was never produced, I think it would be really exciting. I want to see them all, but that's the first one that I want to see.
Arminda, what about you?
If I have to pick, if I have to choose, then I have to choose Liberty Deferred.
Okay.
I do, because I mean I love John Henry, and I'm a blues woman, so I want to dive into John Henry on any given day, but Liberty Deferred has there's so much going, and the use of spectacle, just the oral and visual and all of it. I wanna see how much, I want to watch that happen. There are things, there's a map with, with segregated states and blackface, and that, I mean, there's so much going on. I just want to, who doesn't want to play with that? That's just, I mean.
Well, it's interesting you said, because I feel like in some ways, Liberty Deferred has been staged and restaged in small bits. I mean, I think of Douglas Turner Ward's, Day of Absence. I think
absolutely,
things like that, where in the tradition, we have this ongoing kind of discourse of how do we see ourselves, each other, how do they see us, and then how do we then look at the way we look. I mean, the whole notion of the cakewalk, the whole notion of the minstrel show, and all those things really, really, We've
seen the pieces, but I just, I like to dig up the old things. I like to dig up the old things and dust them off and dive in and live in them for a while and then see what we have and what we want to say. And it hasn't had that. So I would like to give it that.
Well, I want to get into trouble here and introduce a couple of names, a guy named Du Bois and a guy named Alain Locke.
Yeah,
About where they are in this conversation we're having. I mean, we had the Booker T. Washington thing with the kitchenette. So let's bring up our theorists, our guys thinking about theater and stuff like that. Kinohi or Autumn, would you like to go for that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about Du Bois in here, right? Because he was so deeply invested and divested from theater at various moments, right? But was always really kind of thinking about the spectacular, the performative. I mean, I'm thinking here about the large scale pageants that he staged. And
I want to interrupt you. I want to ask you a question. Yeah. Is Liberty Deferred a pageant?
I was thinking it's like cinematic to me almost, right? Yeah. Which I think, but it does kind of have like the pageant collage aesthetic. And I think that one of the things that we see with Du Bois playing with theater at different moments, and he also kind of drafted different versions of plays that were never published and never produced, and all of these things, is I think really wrestling, to your point about the pageant, wrestling with a form that could really convey the complexity of Black collective life and Black spectatorship, and to really play with what format and mode might we be able to think about these things critically and take them seriously and stage them, for lack of a better word. Sometimes it was a novel, sometimes it was a play, sometimes it was the newspaper, sometimes it was the essay, right? But I do think putting him in the mix as somebody who thought about the uses and the utility of theater as both aesthetic form and also political project is really interesting here.
You know, there's interesting, someone just in the chat mentioned Paul Robeson.
Oh yeah.
It's so fascinating.
She could be in
it's really, you know, and one of the interesting details about his life that people don't know is he originally got a full scholarship to come to Princeton, but Princeton said we can't have a Negro. So a woman named Lena Calhoun, Cora Calhoun, who was Lena Horne's grandmother, arranged a scholarship for him to go to Rutgers. Phi Beta Kappa, graduated with honors, played football, and went to law school. It's just interesting when you look at the history of the different institutions and how they mirror our history and how they also inflect and help. We have to think about where we are. We have to always think about what they represent and what they represented and what they represent today. So I'm just wondering, Kinohi, you wrote an essay a couple of years ago about Black experimental novelist William Melvin Kelly in American literary history. And how are you thinking about the ways Black artists were experimenting with their artistic and political engagement during this time? And do you see that playing out today? And I'm curious about your philosophy of experimentation. Autumn was talking about experimentation. We're talking about, you know, pageants and notions like that. What do you think about that stuff?
Yeah, well, as you were responding to me and responding to my fellow panelists, I multiplied the number of works that fall in Liberty Deferred's tradition, including George C. Wolfe's The Colored Museum, but then even something like Random Acts of Flyness, right? I mean, once you sort of understand what's at the heart of Liberty Deferred, which, as Autumn said, is not just a political project, but really an innovation in aesthetic form, you see it play out. And this is the really radical thing. Even though it wasn't realized. I think this is the key. The point about speculation and the archival record, even if we don't have access to archival sources, I think the practice of Black speculation lives on. And Liberty Deferred's non-production, and yet it's influence formally, I think is testament to that. And you certainly see that in the Black arts movement, which revives the kind of episodic experimentation we see in Liberty Deferred and in years after that. Black arts was another great era of massive investment in the theater. And much like the New Deal, era, it had a lot of promise, a lot of good intentions, but as Amiri Baraka and as Douglas Turner Ward, may he rest in peace, would be able to tell us today, those good intentions also led to compromise and things that diminish the independence of Black theatrical production over the past several decades. So while Black arts, I think, really represented in the 1960s a revival of Black experimentation. And when I say theater, I don't just mean institutional theater, but street theater,
Yeah.
right? Performance spaces, outdoors, indoors. The funding structure of a lot of Black arts companies also led to compromises that we see happen in the New Deal era as well. So the key, I think, is to stress how experiment and formal innovation live on despite these material setbacks.
And there's a kind of history in life that a cycle to theater companies, 5 to 7 years, and then we have to start again. We have to rethink it, or we have to think about the theater. I mean, we have kind of a notion that theater companies last forever, but Douglas Turner Ward, the whole idea was, I want to train as many people as I can. I don't want to build a building. So you're really right about that. And the fact that he got it from an article, I mean, a scathing critique, We See You White People, basically in 1966, that then he gets 1.5 million from the Ford Foundation and really goes forward with the idea of, I'm going to build an institution that will train people so they can go out in the world, much as Anita Bush had done with the Lafayette Players, much as we find the American Negro Theater.
Much as Abram Hill did with the
Yes,
Negro Theater.
exactly. So and there's this continuum of knowing that we have to keep training, we have to keep doing it. And someone mentioned Shirley Graham Du Bois in the chat, and I just want to say that it's really important for us to acknowledge the women who were so important. Rose McClendon is mentioned in this, and she was considered one of the finest actresses of her time. Anita Bush, who starts the Lafayette Players, which lasts until 1932, and then she joins the Federal Theater Project. So the women are really important in terms of this narrative, this time. And Hallie Flanagan, of course, who is kind of a one-person battleship to, small and tiny, but determined and organized to really make sure that these theater companies have a chance to thrive, as it were. I mean, it's only 4 years of the history that we're looking at. And so I just want to, Autumn, I'm just wondering, do you have an idea of what you think caused the project to come apart, the Federal Theater Project to come apart? How did the push for integration kind of signal the end of a visionary theatrical moment?
Oh, I feel like Arminda probably has the better.
Oh, okay, well, let Arminda go at it. It's fine. Arminda, go at it. You're on the spot.
I mean, it's the DIES committee. It's the DIES committee, which is the beginning of the House Un-American Activities Committee. It's the merging of civil rights with communism, which has been the stick used to beat the civil rights movement.
It's true.
Definitely from that time on. If it's preaching Black rights, it's communist or it's un-American. It is by definition un-American, yes.
Well, integration is un-American.
By definition.
The whole idea. I mean, when you also look at the notion of redlining, the notion of if a neighborhood is integrated, it's disintegrated.
It's by definition a bad neighborhood. You absolutely can't get money to live there because what made it bad? You coming. That's what made it bad. So I think that and the need to compromise with that, why didn't Liberty Deferred get produced? Because it was 1938 and the DIES committee was coming. And, and maybe there was resistance from white actors, but there was absolutely top-down pressure even on Roosevelt to explain why you're spending this money on
tiny
things
portion.
that feel like this.
The National Endowment was. I mean, it's like
exactly.
You kind of go the issues that come up around the funding of arts by government. When you look at most countries in the world that consider themselves to be forward-thinking and progressive, the notion of funding arts is fundamental to the society and the culture. So you wonder, why are we so anti-arts in this culture, and why has it taken so long for us to start to study and understand this history as well? taking a Quaker moment here because I'm just thinking about all the things we're bringing up and trying to
We've
figure
had
out.
our testimony in
So
that.
one of the things that struck me in Liberty Deferred, yeah, it was really, I mean, was the Ira Aldridge moment.
Mhm.
He's a man who, it's so interesting because, I quickly Googled it, and he's born in 1807, which in Liberty Deferred is the year that they're talking about that we will stop the importation of people of color to be slaves to this country. And so then you see an Ira Aldridge who has to go abroad to have an incredible, he's the only African-American with a plaque at Stratford-upon-Avon. He's the only one of the 33 actors there, having this amazing career, but having to leave this country. And so in some ways you wonder, why didn't more Black people want to leave and go to Africa? Why didn't they go to other places? When you, Zora Neale Hurston's book, not Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, Passing, one of her characters is he wants to go to Brazil. He wants to leave the country because he feels there's more freedom there. Again, mythologized notions of other places to be, because the racism is so horrific here. So I just wonder, in terms of thinking about, what you talk about, Kinohi, in terms of your notions. I pulled this off my shelf. I have to make you get a good laugh when you're talking about you're talking about visuals and like kind of this culture. I mean, whenever I see that, I'm just wondering, how does that figure into this kind of thinking of freedom and rethinking the text and rethinking ourselves as a people?
That's a really good question. And I'm glad you brought up Survey Graphic and the New Negro.
Yes.
Locke's amazing collection, which really concretized a lot of the aesthetic energy going on during the now what we know as the New Negro Renaissance in the 1920s. What's interesting is that in the sort of debate over Black art, its form and function between a Du Bois and a Locke, Locke might have prevailed in the 1920s, where a kind of valorization of primitivist and a connection, an ancestral connection to the African past were really held up. Du Bois's emphasis on what he called propaganda, but really was a more precise investment in telling the truth to America, regardless of who your audience was, really came to the fore in the 30s. So there's an interesting way that Du Bois's emphasis on propaganda and truth-telling develops with the social realist theater of the 1930s. Now, how does this connect to Africa? Well, the combination of social realist aesthetics and Black people's connection to Africa takes the form of a kind of Pan-Africanist vision that's less about folk or primitivist ritual and more about sort of concrete material connections like the Garvey movement, like sort of not repatriation, but a kind of thinking about decolonization efforts as part and parcel of the Black condition in diaspora. So you have less of the Hughesian beating of drums that you see in the 20s and more of this proto-Pan-Africanist or proto-decolonization impulse in these plays. I certainly heard that in The Big White Fog. It's a kind of, even though it's set in the 20s, the competing visions you hear are really much about the 30s, looking forward to the 60s, if that makes any sense.
Makes total sense. And, Arminda earlier on mentioned in Dahomey, which is 1901, 1902.
1903.
Thank you very much.
1902 to 1903.
Thank you very much. See, this is why you have to have an archivist and someone who knows this stuff. But in that play, we start out in America in the first act, and we see these people. And in the second act, these same people, the types, are in Africa, kind of enacting and reenacting the idea that there is this connection. And so this idea of creating a heritage, of building a heritage, of bridging it, doing, going one step more than the Cubists who are like enjoying Africa, and Picasso's enjoying this. But for African Americans, it's the idea of this is our heritage, this is who we are, and we have to claim our culture. And one of the things that I really liked about these three plays, they really show very different notions and ideas of what it is to be an African American, different ideas. And so part of what the project did was really show that there were really different ways to think about this. There was no monolithic person or way of being. And so Autumn, I'm just wondering, in your work, as you think about this and the spirit of imagination in African American culture, African American communities, how do you play with that?
Yeah, I love this idea that you just mentioned about kind of refusing the idea of a single heritage, right? That there is not one. We can't reduce.
Look at us.
Right. It's irreducible, right? And while there's all these different ways of imagining different connections to Africa or not, right? I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about these plays, and especially about the last one, right, is that we see playing out here, and we see articulated the different ways that individuals and people and groups asserted their relationship to the nation or not, right? And so I think that this idea of kind of how one imagines one's relationship to the nation, how one imagines one's relationship to the past, how one imagines or doesn't one's relationship to the state, right? That is always kind of at play in Black creative production, right? And so I think that's at the heart of it, right? There's not a single narrative thread. It's even in Survey Graphic, right? Part of the project of Survey Graphic is that there is not a single new Negro, right? There are many different routes and routes and geographies and genealogies. And theater actually seems really primed to take up that task, right? Because it's always about the live, it's always about the performance, it's always about different folks taking on and performing the same character, but different actors, right? So it seems to be playing with that very notion of kind of the irreducibility of a single essence, right? For lack of a better word, and kind of always staging it as a site of play and imagination.
Right, and even in that, we have disputes about what's proper to stage, what's proper to see, how do we present it. I mean, when I was doing research for today, I came across A. Philip Randolph's talking about Shuffle Along, and the ways in which he talked about it. I mean, you would think, oh my gosh, this was a horrific, awful thing. He was basically saying, get out of that theater, don't go see that. Go see a classical artist perform. Go see someone play the music of Beethoven. And you just go like, wait a minute, this is a radical. This is A. Philip Randolph, the sleeping quarters, a Marxist, a radical, a young man who refused to go to serve the country, during World War I, who could have gone to prison for the rest of his life, but the judge couldn't believe a Negro had that idea. It must have been a white man who told him, which is just hysterical when the judge says that. So I'm thinking about how complex the history is, that the theater really helps capture that for us and helps us understand that these discourses are ongoing. They've been from the beginning. I mean, in the 1700s in Philadelphia, you have James Forten calling a meeting to say, let's get out of this country. And by the end of the meeting, the Black people are saying, we don't want to leave this country. We built this country. James Forten was third generation of African American in the United States. So you kind of realize there's this complicated, do we segregate? Do we integrate? Do we stay? Do we go? And you see all those struggles in the theater. And then when you think about the new Federal Theater Project, which is at first headed by whites who are trying to figure out what are the messages we can allow Black people to explore and have. Then you start to understand why Liberty Deferred could be written, but not produced.
Yeah.
Go on, Autumn, you want to say something?
It just also got me thinking about kind of the notion of the theater as its own kind of institution too, right? Even as, the institution where we see kind of the competing rhetorics and visions stage, right? It's still kind of, it's an institution in its own right. So I think that's just another interesting layer of complexity there.
And we have Dr. Barbara Ann Teer's National Black Theater. We have the National Black Theater Festival. We have these interesting spaces. New Federal Theater, going 50 years of the new Federal Theater, Woody King connecting with this heritage and this history and bringing it alive in a way that's really quite remarkable. And then we get, I'm gonna get in trouble here, but we get a Colored Girls, which is in some ways that pageant, that story, remade, reimagined in the voice of a woman of color going through struggles in her life. So, you know, I feel like I'm talking a lot. I just wonder if any questions that you guys have or anything you want to raise, Kinohi or Arminda or Autumn, on the spot.
I'd like to commend CLASSIX because this was an amazing opportunity to see these plays come alive in a unique format, but also with a group of talented actors who, at least for me, are bringing these plays and showing us how they matter to 2021. Regarding what I'd like to see staged today, there was something about the way CLASSIX performed Natural Man, where I could almost feel, even though we're in gallery view, I could almost feel the electricity in the shared movement among the actors. And so it wasn't simply the words being uttered, the dialogue being expressed, but the keen direction that it took so that the actors could be in sync, if you will, in their movement.
It is not easy in it's not easy.
I imagine
so beautifully
it wasn't.
Done. So the detail, the level of specificity and just the love. Can we say just the love that went into putting together that 10 minutes of that piece? Yeah, it definitely made me yearn for more.
And it was exactly that kind of in sync direction, despite the limitations of remote presentation, that made me want to see more. I mean, it's not live and in person in the way theater normally would be, but I think it's still drawing on the repertoire of Black theatrical experience to make it come alive for us in ways that I found deeply meaningful. So I'd love to see Natural Man in whatever form, and just to sort of get that embodied sense of how these actors really take these roles to heart and show me that they do. And so I commend them. I commend everyone who worked on all three readings, but Natural Man for me was electric.
You know, it's interesting. I'm thinking, you know, as a theater person, you know, COVID has totally impacted our world, our environment, and America and the world. And we're going to come back in 2022 in new ways in terms of thinking about what can be staged and how it should be staged. And I think it offers an interesting possibility for plays that were not stageable to be seen and to be taken in a way. I was at a conference a few weeks ago of dance, and all these dance professionals and dance artists were talking about the fact that, okay, we wouldn't let them put it on the screen before, but now we have to put it on the screen. And so it's like really changed the whole narrative of what is doable, what is seeable, and then what we expect from this. So I just want to tell you that we're going to get into question and answers very soon, but there was one in the chat here that I thought we should try to look at, and says if we could discuss the role of audiences for the Negro Unit productions, and partly the affordability, you know, how did they draw the audiences, what were the ticket prices, all those kinds of things, and more broadly, who was the intended audience for these productions? And part of their purpose was to provide accessibility and performance for people who were disadvantaged. So who would like to talk about that? Okay, I will. The ticket prices were from a nickel to 5 to 50 cents, but you could also go free. And it just depended on productions. And there were children's productions. When someone mentioned Shirley Graham Du Bois, she'd written an opera, but she also did a marionette adaptation of Little Black Sambo. So it's really important to understand the complexity of these, you know, of our people and the stories that we grow up with and the ways in which we think about them. But the whole idea was that it's kind of, this is a weird thing to say, but it's like Joe Biden saying, I want, within 5 miles, I want everybody to be able to get vaccinated. Well, that's how Hallie Flanagan was about the theater. She wanted everybody, whatever community they were in, to be able to see themselves on stage. So we have the Negro units, but we also have the Yiddish units. We have the French-speaking units. The difference was there was no notion that there would become a Yiddish nation or that there would be a separatist Yiddish anything in this country. But for Black people who had dreamt of a theater of some kind, you know, do we want our own theater? Do we separate it? And then what happens when you have white people running the Black theater, which is what the Federal Theater Project was. You know, eventually they turned over, I mean, you know, John Houseman starts it out in Harlem with Orson Welles, who's 21 years old at the time, working with the Macbeth, which becomes a big success and takes them basically out of Harlem. We have this really interesting narrative that happens of successful Black shows then taking the companies apart in a way. We have that with Anna Lucasta with the American Negro Theater. We have this idea of, well, so success means you can't be in your community, you can't be connected to theater anymore there. So it's time for us to look at some questions and start thinking about things people want to ask us. So please drop your questions in the Q&A, and I think I'm supposed to click on this and look at them. Yeah, okay, thanks. Okay, there's a question here. I'm wondering if white actors during this time would perform in these plays. Arminda, you want to help us with that one?
From what we know, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
But we don't know what we don't know, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So we don't have an indication that it was the reluctance of actors that stalled Liberty Deferred. It may have been, and I'll also just throw in really quickly that Liberty Deferred was one of 3 living newspaper pieces done about race relations. None of those were produced. They did living newspapers on slum housing, on labor unions, on farmers, on the power grid. But when it got to Black people, they was just like, oh, sorry, this is a little bit too hot. But they kept trying to write it. They kept,
And remember, again, you have different constituencies with African Americans. There's some Black people that we don't need to see that on stage. We don't want to see the impoverishment. We don't want to know that. And you have white audiences that are like, why are you un-American? Why are you saying that America isn't the greatest country in the world? These people go work, they can get whatever they want, all that kind of stupidity and nonsense. We have a great question here from someone who is a really great theater person. He's wondering if the panelists can discuss Theodore, an integrated play which was performed simultaneously across the country. It's revived in the late 1940s with Lloyd Richards and Roy Steiger in the cast. Arminda, you want to talk about that?
My knowledge of Theodore is really limited to the fact that Ossie Davis was in a production of it.
Well, mine is more limited. I've only seen pictures, and they're stunning and amazing. But
I know that it happened. I know that it was a big part of the Seattle. I think it started in Seattle. I want to say that it was in the Seattle unit, and that it actually had it got the emotions of the longshoremen. I'm having a moment here, but in the audience, like a big emotional response from the audience there. So it was very successful, and I think that's why it kept going. And also it did preach a kind of a unity, the possibility of unity,
integration.
In the face of labor unions that were not necessarily so receptive to that. So exactly. It was attempting something, and that's pretty much what I can
well, that's more than we do. So thank you very much. I'm sure that we can all research that. I think that's something that people would really want to go in and learn about, because it is an important work.
And we should. Theodore is a really important work of this time, from this time.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me when you were talking about that was, I remember there's a play that's done where the actors are forbidden to get on the stage. This is in one of the other units, or this is not, I don't know if it's Federal Theater Project at all, but where the actors actually, it was like about unionizing in the union and stuff like that. Someone will put in the chat, I'm sure someone will know this, but where the actors went to the theater, they were forbidden to get on the stage, and they sat in the theater and performed the play. It's a Mark Blitz, I think it's Mark Blitz. I'm not sure, but I just remember when you were talking about that, it brought up for me that idea. So it's a question here from Autumn. Autumn, you mentioned the speculative imaginary with regards to the living newspaper piece, and I love that idea. I wonder if that has any relationship with Hartman's critical fabulation to you. Oh.
Oh, sure. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think they're certainly related and tied. And so Saidiya Hartman theorizes a methodology, which she calls critical fabulation, which really is going into the archive and imagining what could have been or what might have been, right? And I think something similar is happening in those scenes in the living newspaper. So I certainly think it's part of the same project and the same vocabulary. And that's really useful to think about it that way.
There are so many really amazing questions. I mean, I'm like, okay, so one that hits me right here is like the challenge of sustainability. You know, how do we move the needle? How do we make the theater world, the ways in which we think about the theater, survive in our culture, in our country? I'm looking for a seer, a prophet.
I mean, two things struck me with that question. And the first is like actually just thinking about a fiscally and formally financially stable kind of theater practice. And the other is thinking about kind of the ephemerality of certain kinds of plays and practices and productions. And the latter, the ephemerality, seems to be something that I think has value, right? Thinking about Black theatrical production in particular as something that's always in the making, right? Always kind of a process rather than a product. But I think those are just two different ways to think about that question. I don't have any solutions to the former, but the latter to me seems to be kind of baked into the very vertebrae of theater.
I love this. I love the thing you've said, and it's just a phrase you did, the practice of theater.
Yes.
And there's I think that is, I'm groping towards that is, I think, where we'd have to go. I think that's why these things tend to soar when they are community based. Right. When you have the Kriegwald players, for us, by us, about us, and near us, that is, it works for that moment.
Right.
And it works beautifully for that moment. When you have the American Negro Theater going, everybody is going to do everything, and we're all going to, pay together and reap together and work together. That works for that moment. When you get to Anna LaCosta and everybody's like, well, this is the way you can go to Broadway and you can have a real career and you can be a professional, that falls apart. So, I mean, it's something, there is a practice of theater. It's only sustainable if you are in an environment where the practice can be sustained without, but it doesn't seem compatible with needing that to be your primary mode of livelihood. It's just, I mean, and I don't know the way around that.
But I think,
is this time for our Quaker moment now?
Well, I was gonna say no, but the point you make is really good. The people who practice theater will always continue to practice theater.
Right.
It doesn't matter what obstacles there are. We will continue to do it. And one of the things that we're looking at now in this moment, what will it be in 2022? How will we do that? I mean, people keep talking about the notion of coming back. Someone answered for me, the play I was thinking about was Cradle Will Rock, the musical, that. So thank you very much, chat people. And I had a question, one person asked 3 questions, so I'm gonna kind of combine. What's next for CLASSIX? Are you gonna do something at Princeton? Are you gonna do a production? That's one of the first question. They wanna know, how many units are there? How many theaters are offshoots of these federal theater project things? And were the units subsidized by the government? I can answer that one. Yes, they were subsidized by the government. There were 17 of them. That's what our
there were 22 in the end.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And
although the Birmingham one did not do very well. They had varying degrees of success.
Okay, thank you.
But
as I told you, I thought there were only 3, and I thought I knew everything. So I was like totally surprised to learn that. So here's a question. What is really sustainable within capitalism and our current commercial work or patronage via philanthropy model? That's a serious scholarly question, folks.
I think it builds on what Arminda and Autumn were talking about in the previous round, because I want to emphasize something Arminda said. It's not just for us and by us, but also near us. And as Douglas Turner Ward experienced with the Ford Foundation, it was that near us that proved an issue for Negro Ensemble Company. Ford was happy to give him the funds, but the theater itself would go to St. Mark's Playhouse in the East Village, not in Harlem. And as soon as that was announced, Black critics and Black audiences were highly critical of the move, because whatever good intentions lay behind the funding and whatever great work the NEC produced, which by the way it did, numerous Obie and Tony Award nominations and wins, the fact that St. Mark's was not going to be at the heart of at least Manhattan's African-American neighborhood meant that questions of access and affordability were going to inflect how many people NEC could reach. And if we look back to the Federal Theater Project and its Negro units, issues of near us tend to pop up. You know, and you might say, well, it's all in the same city, but in the case of Big White Fog, the Loop is different from DuSable High School, right? The two places where it was staged. Now it folded after going to the DuSable, and there are different historical reasons for that. But, you know, the Loop is going to attract a mixed race and, you know, a certain kind of audience. So the near us is something that top-down funding opportunities tend to struggle with. Can they just give money to actually support improved infrastructure in Black communities themselves so that theaters will be sustained in the long term? Putting the money there and investing there isn't just about a building, it's about a community. And what we find with the New Deal and with the Ford Foundation is a lack of investment in that community that can sustain Black theater over time, not just for 4 or 5 years.
But again, we have the destructive nature of our notion of how you fund theater, the destructive idea of what government should not do in terms of the arts. I mean, remember, we're in a country where the idea of funding the arts is anathema when you have other more important things like military. I'm sorry, being a little sarcastic there. And so, so it's really complicated in terms of thinking about how did we get here in this country? Well, you can start with the Puritans, people who thought the theater was evil and wicked, and that idea, and the idea of working for anything where you're not making as much money as you possibly can is being kind of a, you know, a cheat on life. I mean, it's really quite a fascinating dichotomy we live in the culture, where all of a sudden everything is commercialized, everything is really thought to have a value. I was looking at Rena Fraden's book on the Negro units. She wrote a really excellent text, and one of the things she talked about was exactly this idea of spatial, who can be where, how can we impact communities, how can we be in different places. And you know, and Douglas Turner Ward, I think it was very brave of him to say, I'm going to put my theater downtown. Number one, I don't want it in the Broadway district. I don't want it in Harlem, because traditionally, you know, the Bleecker, that area downtown was where a Black community lived from 1790s until, you know, the 1930s and 40s. So it was a brave thing, but I think it was also a choice to say, we're not going to be a commercial theater. We're going to be experimental. We're going to do very different kinds of theater. And remember, we'd also had downtown productions of In White America, 1961 at the Sheridan Playhouse. And we had the Blacks, you know, Gene Frankel. So there was a kind of notion of, this is the place to be for what we're going to do. We're not going to be the theater that does the work that only people in Harlem will want to see. People in Harlem will want to see our work, but we're going to put ourselves in a place where people is accessible. Basically, we're going to create a theater space. Basically, and I remember going to the Lortel Theater and seeing, you know, Brownsville, you know, the play written by the guy who Soldiers Play. You know what I'm talking about. Arminda, you know what I'm talking about, don't you?
Yeah, say it again.
Yeah, I said, it's like, it's so funny when you're like in your brain, it's like in your brain, you know exactly who you wrote A Soldier's Play.
Oh, yes. Oh, stop it.
New Man in the Sign.
Stop it. No.
Someone will put in the
Charles
chat,
Fuller.
save us, chat people. Huh?
Thank you.
Charles Fuller.
Thank you.
very much.
I'm like,
Thank God we have 3 academics here who can't remember anything. I almost said a word that would have gotten me bleeped off the air here. But anyway, okay, let me get back to the questions. Can we talk a little bit more about the relationship between movement towards racial justice or racial equity in the Federal Theater Project and the ending of the Federal Theater Project? Arminda?
Can we talk more about, I mean, it just feels so clearly like, if I say it is what it is, I'm so going to get hounded tomorrow by my CLASSIX crew. But
Don't get hounded. I already got in trouble.
But I mean, this is the thing that happened. The notion that this was a theater, first of all, that this was a theater movement for people, that was a problem. It was going to be a problem anyway. A workers' theater, a working class people's theater that was affordable and for masses. Anything that wasn't children's theater was going to be a problem. Yeah. Long term. And then when you get in the clear mission to put it in Black communities, to put dollars in Black actors and writers and directors' hands to see the training and development of Black performance, that was going to be a death knell. It was running on borrowed time.
Okay.
It was running on borrowed time. It was, the backlash is always the thing that the backlash is always coming. It is always about what you can get done before it hits, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I have to, to me, Hallie did an incredible thing. Kinohi, you want to say something? Please, go right ahead.
June 30th, 1939. That's when the House voted to take funds from the project and redistribute it to other arts initiatives. And it's exactly as Arminda said, this project was living on borrowed time because of the number of progressives, socialists, and communists who were working on it. And also because, frankly, the Negro units were an integral part of the Federal Theater Project writ large. Yeah. Rena Freyden recounts in her book, Blueprints for a Black Federal Theater, which Catherine Young just listed in the Q&A, that part of the committee's testimony wasn't just hearing any number of people who could object to the supposed communist or Marxist influence of the plays, but also they heard from one white person who was in production who said that she was asked out on a date by a Black man.
Right.
And the fear of interracial contact, which at that time doubled as a fear of communist influence. Ralph Ellison dramatizes this, as Arminda said, was palpable. And the red baiting is not just a function of post-war McCarthyism. It's right here in the 30s. And the Negro units were a victim of that. And race was not incidental to this. It was part and parcel of the red baiting going on.
It's interesting, we're talking about this period, and in some ways we're not really acknowledging what had been the American theater before that. So Autumn, could you give us a little idea of the marked difference with what Negro theater was prior to this? When we look at minstrelsy, when we look at the earlier productions that were framing this kind of progressive theater that we're talking about, but what's going on in American theater at this time? How are we being presented in the stage?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important and really interesting. So like if we even just look back right to the 1920s, like the decade just that preceded it, right? I mean, this was also a moment of intense theatrical performative life, right? And on the one hand, I mean, there big Broadway performances like Shuffle Along. And on the other hand, there was still really a desire and an appetite for kinds of Black stage representation that emerged and directly referenced the long history of the minstrel tradition and the minstrel show. And I think as important as kind of the stereotypical, violently derogatory caricatures that were being, at the heart of the minstrel tradition. I mean, I think also what is at play there is kind of this desire for white audiences to see a certain kind of articulation of Blackness on stage. And at the very same time, there was this idea that Blacks and African Americans were natural performers, right? That it was just something that they were naturally good at, right? Music, dance, this was their innate talent. So that's the 1920s. And I mean, that stretches through the 10s and the 1890s. And then there's a longer history of Black performance in theater in the 19th century. And I'm thinking of someone like William Wells Brown, right, who was kind of a master innovator of theater and performance. But this idea of kind of that African Americans had a natural aptitude for performance and movement and stage life, and coupled with the idea that there was this appetite to see Blacks performing in these very traditional stereotypical roles, was really kind of inflecting theater. And then the Negro Units, right, it was markedly different because it was really breaking apart that idea that this is a natural talent, right? It actually is a tutor talent. It is we are experts at this, right? I mean, this is what we do for work. It's not just something that we show up and are just good at, right? So I think that that's kind of one of the main breaking points, in addition to the shift in representation, right? We are in many ways creating our own kind of stories that break apart, right? That are turned away from the minstrel tradition that really did dominate American popular culture, was really at the center of it for so long.
It's so interesting because minstrelsy easily translates to radio, to film, to all the different aspects. It's international. We have Black minstrels after the Civil War. We have companies of minstrels. We have McCabe. We have others as well working. And so it's really kind of totally in the culture. I mean, it's like it's something everywhere. And so then you come in with these plays that are like living newspapers about people, and you come in with these social realist things, and you're dealing with all these different things. I mean, it just must have been like a shocker to an audience that had only seen Black people singing and dancing. Even some of the Black people only seen Black people singing and dancing.
I mean, you do also have the little theater movement that's part of the 20s, the one acts by Publish in Opportunity and The Crisis, some of which get stage. You get the Howard University Players and the Kruger Players, and so you do have, largely led by women. So you have, that movement, Eulalie Spence and Mae Miller, and those, and those aren't large audiences, but I do think, and Regina Anderson, it's the Andrews, the librarian, I think it's both names, up at 135th Street at the Harlem Experimental Theater. Yes, which becomes Schomburg, the Harlem Experimental Theater. So, you do have the beginnings. I think in part, one of the things that seeds the Negro Units is this little theater movement that you have these places that are ripe for this to continue, because the Depression has knocked the wind out. It has, kind of knocked the ground out of some things that were being patronized by people who then didn't have the funds to pay to do it anymore. So there was some there, but absolutely the 19th century tradition loomed large, and that need to entertain.
Larger than we want to remember, honestly.
Well, not me, because when you ask what CLASSIX is doing next, is we're doing a podcast that is
What's it
launching. We're doing a podcast. The podcast is called Reclamation. We're gonna cover various eras in Black performance, and the first one up is a 5-part series on Black performance in the era of minstrelsy. So yeah.
Oh, I can't wait. I'm making a shameless plug. I was invited to be part of that. So I'm really excited and looking forward to see what a podcast looks like. I mean, it's going to be fun. But one of the things that, that you made me think about, you're absolutely right. There's a little theater movement happening. It's very important in African American culture. Alain Locke, Montgomery, Gregory at Howard University, these guys are really pushing this idea. And also the women, exactly as you said, the women playwrights. I mean, Georgia
Douglas Johnson, and
I mean, these amazing people of consciousness. And of course, earlier we have Angelina Weld Grimke, with her 1916 play, Rachel. But one of the things that there was a question that I really want us to get to, which I don't know if we even know the answer. I think I sort of know the answer to, but it was like, speak to the Black acting methodologies that were practiced within the Federal Theater Project, Black units, especially with the mentioned contribution of Black directors in this work. What traditions came out of these Black units? Okay, so I get to answer. I know it's kind of, the Big White Fog, opened in Chicago in 1938, and then it came to New York. It premiered at the Lincoln Theater, 1940, and it ran under a company called the Negro Playwrights Company. And it ran for 64 performances. And the director was a guy named Powell Lindsay. Now, Powell Lindsay is someone who I was personally acquainted with. I was very fortunate. He had worked with Langston Hughes with Suitcase Theater. He was a playwright and a director and a filmmaker and all these things. But and he was born in 1905. So in the 1970s, he resurrected Suitcase Theater in Michigan, where I was. And Suitcase Theater, the idea was, it was Seacoast Theater in its original production, ran uptown on 125th Street. And there was a show by Langston Hughes called Don't You Want to Be Free? Again, one of these kind of, it's the wrong word to say pageant show, but it's a show in which you're telling the history of African-American culture. James Earl Jones' father starred in that play. He was the star of it. And so Powell Lindsay decided in the 70s to resurrect Suitcase Theater in Michigan for young people, teenagers, to travel, to go around the world. And the idea was, African-American, Asian Americans, Native Americans, Black, white, everything working together, performing the works of Langston Hughes. So at the ripe old age of 17, I got to be Langston Hughes in England, Germany, Belgium, Holland, and London. That's part of, yeah, and Wales, which was the most amazing thing, because in Wales, I got to hear the Negro spirituals sung in Welsh, because the Fisk Jubilee Singers had gone to the 1870s, and the people felt they were the Blacks of Europe, so they learned the music. But all that to say that Powell Lindsay was of the traditional school of directing, as was Owen Dotson, this idea of you plot things out, you map them out, you figure it out, kind of the, in some ways, method acting, a little bit of that, but mostly really a kind of that American grown thing of we want a natural look on the stage, we want it to feel natural, but you have to really study, you have to really be prepared, and you have to know your lines. And so if anything, it's interesting because when you read about the Macbeth, Orson Welles had a loudspeaker that a megaphone that he directed from when he was 21 years old in Harlem doing that play, which was so successful, ran for months and months and went all over the country and all that. But you get the idea that the actors who came were already trained.
Right.
They had trained in the Lafayette Players. They had trained with Rose McClendon. Rose McClendon was considered one of the finest actresses of her time. So they came, and in some ways they trained Orson, because a 21-year-old doesn't know anything. I'm sorry, young people, I hate to tell you that. You will learn, you will get it, but he didn't know what he was doing. And John Houseman really wanted, and he was clear that he wanted to do this to launch his career, which it did. So what I would say is that the African Americans, Carlton Moss, who came out of that, who was an assistant on that, they became in some ways traditionalists in the way they directed, in the ways in which they did what we would think of as really people of the book, if you will. And the point I want to make to Autumn that was really important, James Reese Europe was a really important African-American musician, and he's considered the guy who brought jazz to Europe in World War I. But what's important to think about with him is that his musicians had to pretend they weren't reading the music. They
Right.
had to pretend that they were just playing it naturally. And you know, I have talked and talked and talked and realized that we are really virtually out of time. So is there anything that anyone wants to say quickly at the end to finish us off?
Just thank you for CLASSIX for such a wonderful, wonderful gathering and event and occasion to think about these plays, which we really all should be thinking about all the time, if not just a little more often.
Well, I want to thank you, Arminda. I want to thank you, Kinohi. And I want to thank you, Autumn, for just making my life really, really easy. It was just really incredible. So thank you very much. We're going to say good night to everyone.
Thanks to
And
all of you.
watch for the other projects from CLASSIX as well. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.